the operating philosophy of General Mikhail Scobolev.
White general.
That's the one. A man who, in the late 19th century, became a legend in the Russian Empire and, well, a figure of absolute waking terror for the tribes of Central Asia.
And that quote is basically the skeleton key for this entire deep dive. It's not just about sadism, though, as we'll see. There was plenty of that.
Oh, I'm sure.
It encapsulates the grim engineering of imperial expansion. It marks this specific moment when Russia stopped trying to fight like a European power and started fighting like a ruthless colonial empire.
And today, we're going to unpack exactly how that transformation happened. We're looking at the Russian conquest of the Caucasus in Central Asia. And before you think this is just a list of dates and, dusty maps, I want you to look at the sources we've pulled for this.
We're working with a really fascinating mix today. We have the Leavenworth papers, which, they offer a very technical military analysis of unconventional warfare.
The nuts and bolts of it.
The nuts and bolts. Then we have academic histories from Cambridge that look at the state-building side of things. We've got diplomatic records of the Great Game, that whole spy versus spy rivalry between Britain and Russia.
Right.
And maybe most interestingly, we have modern historiography from the Central Asian Survey that completely flips the script on how these events are remembered today.
Our mission, then, is to connect these dots. We're going to trace a line from the dense, ambush-riddled beech forests of Chechnya all the way to the open, blistering sands of the Turkmen Desert. Because the argument these sources make is that you can't really understand one without the other.
They're the same story, really, just two chapters. The Caucasus was the laboratory. It was the combat school where the Russian military machine, which, was designed to fight Napoleon in neat lines.
It's European battlefield.
Exactly. He got absolutely humbled. They had to break their own rules to win. And then they took those bloody lessons and applied them to the conquest of the Turkmen tribes in the desert.
And the final exam for this combat school was the Great Game.
Yes.
The high-stakes, staring contest with the British Empire over who would control the gateway to India.
That's the whole geopolitical layer. I mean, while Russian soldiers were literally dying of thirst in the desert, you had politicians in London looking at maps and just panicking. They had a name for it.
Nervousness.
Nervousness. It sounds like a condition you'd treat with ointment.
It really does.
But it was a very real, very specific anxiety about the city of Merv. And we'll get to why that one city caused so many ulcers in the British Parliament a little later.
Okay, so we have two theaters of war, distinct but connected. Let's set the stage visually for everyone listening.
Sure. Okay, so picture the southern border of the Russian Empire in the early 1800s. On the western side, between the Black Sea and the Caspian, you have the Caucasus Mountains.
Right.
This is vertical terrain. We're talking dense forests, deep ravines, jagged peaks. This is modern-day Chechnya and Dagestan.
And on the eastern side of the Caspian.
East of the Caspian, the world just flips. It's Transcaspia, modern-day Turkmenistan.
Yeah.
It's flat, it's arid, and it is dominated by the Karakum Desert. It's basically an ocean of sand dotted with these crucial oases.
So two completely different environments.
Polar opposites. But they presented Russia with the exact same problem.
Which was?
Fierce, independent tribal societies that had absolutely zero interest in being ruled by a distant Tsar in St. Petersburg.
Okay, so let's start in the laboratory then. Section 1 of our deep dive, the Caucasus. The year is 1801. Russia has just annexed Georgia. Why does this one act trigger a war that lasts for, 50 years?
It all comes down to geography. Just look at the mental map. Russia is up north. Their new territory, Georgia, is way down south.
And in between?
In between them is this massive mountainous island of independent tribes. To get to their new property in Georgia, the Russians have to cross through territory held by the Mountaineers, the Chechens, the Dagestanis, the Avars.
And the sources describe the Mountaineers as, not the kind of people you just stroll past.
Not at all. They were masters of their environment. For centuries, they had fought off Persians, Ottomans, you name it, and each other. They lived in these fortified villages called auls, often perched on cliffs that were just impossible to assault.
And their whole style of warfare was something the Russian officer class just didn't get.
Oh, they couldn't compute it. The Leavenworth papers make a huge point about this cultural disconnect. The Russian officers were trained in the Napoleonic tradition. They wanted big, decisive battles on open fields.
Where you can maneuver your corps and fire volleys, clean and neat.
Exactly. And the Mountaineers would never give them that. They fought an asymmetric war before that term was really even a thing. Snipers in the trees, avalanches triggered on purpose to block passes, hit and run. They used the forest the way a naval fleet uses the ocean.
So how did the early Russian generals handle this?
Badly, to put it mildly. You had men like General Ermolov, who took command in 1816. He famously called the Caucasus a great fortress that had to be besieged.
Okay, so that sounds like he gets it.
He gets the metaphor,
Yeah.
but his actual tactics were just crude. It was basically a police action on steroids.
What does that look like on the ground?
It's like this. A tribe raids a Russian convoy. So the Russians march in, burn a random village, steal some cattle, and then they leave. They thought this kind of punishment would enforce discipline.
Which, of course, just creates a cycle of
It
revenge.
was a factory for radicalization. The brutality didn't subdue the population. It unified them. I mean, in these tribal societies, vengeance is a duty.
Yeah.
And that's the key insight here. The lack of a coherent Russian strategy created the perfect vacuum for a real leader to rise.
And that leader is Imam Shamil.
Shamil is a titan of 19th century history. He emerges around 1834 as the leader of the Murid movement. Now, the Russians called it Muridism, for the Arabic word for disciple, and they just dismissed it as religious fanaticism.
But he was more than that.
So much more. The sources argue he was a brilliant state builder. He recognized that tribal fragmentation was their greatest weakness. The tribes were always fighting each other as much as they fought the Russians.
So he used Islam to unify them.
He used Islam as the glue, yes. But then he built a functioning theocratic state, the imamate. He established a legal code, the nizam. He set up a tax system. He didn't just lead a mob with swords. He built a standing infantry and cavalry with a real command structure.
I read that he even started manufacturing his own artillery in the mountains.
He did. I mean, think about the logistics of that. He had foundries built into cliffs. He was smelting cannons from scrap metal or recasting captured Russian guns. He was making his own gunpowder from local resources like saltpeter and charcoal. He understood that to fight an empire, you need the tools of an empire. But he never, ever lost sight of his greatest advantage: the terrain.
And this is where the idea of offensive guerrilla warfare comes in.
Right. Because usually we think of guerrillas as defensive,
Yeah.
hiding, surviving. But in the 1840s, Shamil went on the attack. He launched these coordinated campaigns that just wiped out isolated Russian garrisons. In 1843, he effectively retook all of Bavaria from the Russians in a single lightning campaign. He was controlling the tempo of the war.
He was dictating the terms.
Completely. And the Russians were getting desperate. This leads to some really specific military encounters that highlight the painful learning curve Russia had to go through.
Let's talk about the siege of Akulgo in 1839. This happens before Shamil's biggest victories, but it feels pivotal.
It is. It's a classic example of what you'd call a hollow victory. You have this general, Gökdepe, and he's determined to capture Shamil. Shamil had holed up in his fortress at Akulgo. Now, you have to picture this. It's not a castle on a flat plain. It's a fortress perched on these sheer rock cliffs over the Ondi River. It is an absolute nightmare to attack.
And Grab's plan is to just throw men at it.
That was the plan. He laid siege for 80 days. The fighting was horrific, hand-to-hand, room to room, rock to rock. The Russians eventually took the fortress, but they suffered over 3,000 casualties.
3,000 men. And the twist.
The twist is that Shamil got away. He had actually tried to negotiate at one point. He handed over his own 12-year-old son, Jamal al-Din, as a hostage to show good faith.
Wow, that's heartbreaking, giving up your own son.
It is, just to try and save his people. But when the talks broke down, Shamil and a few followers managed to slip away into the mountains to fight another day.
So Russia spent 3,000 lives to capture a pile of rocks, while the symbol of the entire resistance just vanishes.
Exactly. And his legend only grew. He became the man who could not be caught.
But the Russians didn't learn their lesson from that, did they? Because just a few years later, in 1845, we get the Biscuit Expedition.
The disaster at Dargo. Yes, this one was driven by the Tsar himself, Nicholas I. He's sitting in his palace in St. Petersburg, looking at maps, just tired of this endless war. He wants a decisive blow, a knockout punch.
And he thinks he knows how to get it.
He orders General Vorontsov to march 18,000 men deep into the dense forests of Chechnya to capture Shamil's capital, Dargo.
marching 18,000 men in formation into a dense forest against an enemy who lives in the trees. I mean, what could possibly go wrong?
It was a recipe for total disaster. Vorontsov's column was miles long. They were dragging heavy artillery, endless baggage trains, supplies. They were just sitting ducks.
An ambush waiting to happen.
Constantly. The mountaineers didn't even have to fight a pitched battle. They just picked them off.
Yeah.
Sniped the officers, vanished into the woods. Sniped the horses pulling the cannons, vanish.
And by the time the Russians finally get to Dargo,
Shamil's gone. He'd already burned the village to the ground and disappeared. So now the Russians are sitting in the smoking ashes of a village, deep in enemy territory, surrounded, and this is the crucial part, they run out of food.
hence the biscuit expedition.
Soldiers were literally fighting each other for hardtack biscuits. The retreat was a horror show. Shamil's fighters harried them every single step of the way. Snipers in the trees, ambushes at every turn. They lost 3 generals, 186 officers, and over 3,000 men.
That's just devastating.
It was the Russian version of the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. It was the absolute breaking point for the old strategy. It taught the Russian command, finally, that you cannot simply storm the mountains. You can't march a European army into that forest and expect to win.
So how did they finally turn it around? Because eventually they did win. They conquered the Caucasus.
They shifted to what we might call the industrial approach to warfare. This was the strategy of Field Marshal Beryatinsky and his brilliant chief of staff, Dmitry Milyanin. They made a critical decision.
Which was?
They decided to stop chasing Shamil.
Okay, if you're not chasing the enemy, what are you doing?
You're changing the environment itself. They adopted the Maxim, not the bayonet, but the axe.
The axe.
They treated the entire mountain range like a fortress under siege. They started systematically cutting down the forests.
Deforestation as a weapon of war.
Exactly. They cut these huge, wide roads. We're talking hundreds of yards across right through the middle of the Chechen forests. This did 2 things. First, it removed the cover that Shamil's fighters relied on. Second, it allowed the Russians to move their artillery and their supplies securely.
So they're building an infrastructure of conquest.
Perfectly put. They built bridges, they built roads, they built forts every few miles. It wasn't glorious, dashing warfare with cavalry charges.
No, it was slow, methodical.
It was engineering. It
Yeah.
was slow, crushing pressure. They systematically cut off the food supplies to the mountain villages. It wasn't about winning a single battle. It was about strangulation.
And it worked.
It did. By 1859, this relentless pressure finally forced Shamil to surrender. He was cornered on Dunab Mountain. He had no forest left to hide in, no base of support that hadn't been compromised or destroyed. Russia had finally, painfully, learned how to fight an unconventional enemy.
Okay, so that's the combat school phase. Russia has secured its southern flank, but now their eyes turn east, to the desert, to the Turkmens.
And this is where the story shifts gears, from a regional conflict to the high-stakes geopolitics of the Great Game.
This is where the British start freaking out.
Nervousness, it's such a wonderfully British term for what was a very, very serious geopolitical
Can you
anxiety.
explain that for us? What were they so nervous about? Why Merv?
It all centers on this one oasis city, Merv. Now, in the 19th century, Merv was a shadow of its ancient self, but historically it was known as the Queen of the World.
A key stop on the Silk Road.
A critical junction, yes. But for the British, looking at it from their headquarters in India, the geography was terrifying. Because if you call up a map, you'll see Merv is dangerously close to Herat, in what is now Afghanistan. And for the British military, Herat was considered the key to India.
Okay.
The British logic was simple, and they repeated it constantly. If Russia takes Merv, they are just a week's march from Herat. If they take Herat, the road to British India is wide open.
So the British saw the Russian advance into Central Asia not just as, general empire building, but as a direct, almost existential threat to their crown jewel, India.
Precisely. And the Russians knew this. They were very aware that every step they took toward the Turkmen tribes sent these shockwaves through the corridors of power in London.
But the British didn't actually do much to stop it, did they? The sources are pretty clear on that.
That is the great irony of the whole affair. You had these incredibly brave and frankly reckless British agents on the ground, daring figures like Captain Napier and Colonel Macgregor, who were spying, meeting with Turkmen leaders, trying to gauge the Russian threat.
And the Turkmens were asking for help.
They were begging for a British protectorate. They weren't stupid. They knew the Russian bear was coming for them next.
But the government back in London.
The government, particularly under Prime Minister Gladstone, was committed to a policy of what they called masterly inactivity.
Masterly inactivity. That's a great name for doing nothing.
It is. They just did not want to get dragged into a war in the middle of Central Asia. So despite all the panic in the press and the warnings from their own military, they refused to offer any material aid to the Turkmens.
Which left the Turkmens to face the Russians alone.
Completely alone. And the Russians were ready to move. Having subdued the Caucasus, they turned their full attention to the Akaltek Turkmens.
Let's talk about them. The Akaltek. Who were they?
These were nomadic, incredibly fierce warriors. The sources consistently describe them as possessing perfect warrior qualities. They lived in the saddle. They were famous for their horses, the Akaltek breed, which is still legendary today for its endurance, and that incredible metallic sheen to its coat.
And they had a stronghold, right? Geokdepe.
Geokdepe, or Denghel Tepe. And you need to get the image of a European stone castle out of your head.
Right, it's mud walls.
It's a massive, sprawling, mud-walled enclosure in the middle of the desert. It was huge, capable of holding tens of thousands of people. When war came, the entire tribe would retreat inside with their families and their livestock. It was their ark.
So the Russians make their first move in 1879, and this is what our sources call Lomakin's folly.
General Lomakin. He is a textbook case of how not to conduct a colonial campaign. He was, by all accounts, incompetent and extremely eager for glory because he knew he was about to be replaced. So he rushed the whole operation.
What were his biggest mistakes?
I mean, where do you start? Everything, really. He marches his troops across the Kopet-Dag Mountains with only 2 weeks of supplies.
2 weeks? In the desert?
It's insane. He abandoned the original, much slower plan to build a proper supply base. So by the time his troops arrived at the walls of Geokdepe, they were exhausted, they were thirsty, and they were on the brink of starvation.
And then comes the battle itself.
And it gets even worse. The fortress, as we said, was packed with non-combatants, women, children, the elderly, livestock. Standard siege practice at the time, even in this brutal era, was to leave one side of your siege line open.
Why would you do that?
You wanted the non-combatants to flee? It clogs up the enemy's retreat, it causes panic, and frankly, you even wanted the defenders to have a way out so you could cut them down in the open rather than fighting them when they're cornered.
But Lomakin didn't do that.
No. He ordered a bombardment using explosive shells specifically to cause maximum panic and casualties inside the crowded fortress. He wanted a total bag of the enemy. He refused to let anyone escape.
That sounds like a war crime, even by the standards of the time.
It was an atrocity. But here's the thing. Strategically, it completely backfired. Because the Turkmens saw that there was no escape, they fought with the absolute desperation of people defending their families to the last.
And then Lomakin orders the final assault on the walls. And here is the detail that is just, it's almost comical if it wasn't so tragic.
The ladders.
He failed to bring scaling ladders.
It just defies belief. But yes, the Russian infantry charged across hundreds of yards of open ground under heavy fire, reached the base of these high mud walls, and were just stuck. They were huddled there, being shot at from above, with no way to get over.
And that's when the Turkmens counterattacked.
They saw the Russians were totally vulnerable. They poured out of the fortress gates, sabers drawn. It was a complete rout. The Russians suffered 445 men killed and wounded. Lomakin was forced into a humiliating retreat.
A modern European army defeated by a tribal force.
Exactly. The Turkmens had won a shocking, unbelievable victory. It was the most significant defeat in the entire history of the Russian conquest of Central Asia. And for the Russian Empire, it was a humiliation that absolutely could not be allowed to stand.
So they decide to send in the big gun, General Mikhail Scobolev.
The White General. He was famous, charismatic, brilliant, and by all accounts, utterly sadistic. He was sent with a blank check from the Tsar, wipe out the humiliation of 1879. Whatever it takes.
How did Scobolev approach this differently than Lomakin?
In every conceivable way. He applied the lessons of the Caucasus. He did not rush. He brought 7,100 troops, but more importantly, he brought overwhelming logistics. He understood the desert was the real enemy.
So he brought supplies.
He brought 20,000 camels. He even had his engineers build a light railway line as he advanced across the desert to ensure a constant flow of food, water, and ammunition.
He wasn't going to run out of biscuits.
Not a chance. He brought distillation plants to purify water from salty wells. He arrived at Geokdepe in late 1880, fully prepared for a long haul, and instead of ordering a suicidal charge against the walls,
he laid siege.
A proper methodical European-style siege. He treated the mud fortress like it was a citadel in France. He had his men dig parallels, these trenches that creep closer and closer to the walls, and most crucially, he ordered them to dig a mine.
A tunnel right under the walls.
Exactly. So for 23 days, the Turkmens were trapped inside under constant artillery fire, while the Russians were slowly, invisibly burrowing right underneath them. The psychological strain on the defenders must have been immense. They knew something terrible was coming, but they couldn't stop it.
And then came January 1881.
January 12th by the old calendar, 24th by the modern one. The mine was detonated. The sources describe this massive pillar of earth and black smoke shooting hundreds of feet into the sky. The explosion just vaporized a huge section of the mud wall, killing hundreds of defenders instantly.
And the Russian storming columns poured in.
And this time, they didn't need ladders. They swarmed right through the breach, and what followed was not a battle, it was a massacre. The Turkmens, panicked by the sheer shock of the explosion and the breach in their defenses, broke. They fled out of the back of the fortress across the open desert.
And Scobolev let them go this time.
No. He ordered his cavalry, his dragoons and his Cossacks, to pursue. And this is where Scobolev's philosophy, the harder you hit them, became a horrifying reality. The cavalry chased the fleeing Turkmens for 11 miles across the desert.
The numbers in the sources are just staggering.
They are. An estimated 6,500 people killed inside the fort during the storming, and then another 8,000 men, women and children, hacked down by the cavalry while they were fleeing.
8,000. And the Russian losses?
Relatively light, around 290 killed. It was a completely lopsided devastation, a deliberate act of terror.
After the battle, Scobolev allowed his troops to loot the fortress for 4 days.
Yes, it was a sacking in the old medieval style. The only, and I mean the only, silver lining, if you can even call it that, was that the Russians freed about 600 Persian slaves who had been captured and held by the Turkmens.
Right.
But the primary outcome, the strategic goal, was the total annihilation of the Turkmen will to resist.
Which brings us right back to that quote. Scobolev genuinely believed that this level of terror was necessary, that it was even merciful in a twisted way to prevent future insurrections.
And in a cold, brutal, strategic sense, he was right. The Akalteki Turkmens never rose again. The memory of Geokdepe was so traumatic that it pacified the entire region through fear.
Which leads us directly to Merv, the queen of the world, the city the British were so worried about. You'd think after Geokdepe, the Russians would have to fight another massive bloody battle to take Merv.
That's what everyone expected.
Yeah.
But the Russians were clever. They were learning. They realized they didn't need to fight another war. They could use the fear of Geokdepe to take Merv without firing a single shot.
This is section 5 of our deep dive, the peaceful conquest.
Peaceful is definitely in quotation marks. It was conquest by psychological warfare. The Russians sent in agents to convince the elders of Merv to just surrender.
And tell us about this agent Alikhanov. He's a fascinating character.
Alikhanov is amazing. He was a Russian officer, but he was of Avar origin from the Caucasus. He was a Muslim. He spoke the local languages. He could blend in.
So he could operate behind the lines.
Perfectly. He went into Merv disguised, initially as a merchant and then later as an official envoy. And his message to the Merv elders was brutally simple.
What was it?
It was, look at Geokdepe. Do you want that to happen to you? Submit to the Tsar or face Skobelev's fate?
That is a very powerful argument.
He played on their internal divisions. He played on their very correct realization that the British were not coming to save them. And he found a very unlikely but crucial ally inside Merv itself, a woman named Guljamal Khanum.
The widow of a respected former Khan.
Yes, she was a highly respected matriarch in their society. The Russians knew she had influence, so they courted her. There's this wonderful detail in one of the sources that the Empress of Russia herself sent her a gift, an incredibly expensive dress with intricate needlework.
Diplomacy by fashion.
And it seems to have worked. Guljamal Khanum became an advocate for surrender. She convinced the elders that resistance was suicide. So in 1884, a delegation of Merv elders rode out to the Russian lines and swore allegiance to the Tsar.
Just like that. The British nightmare scenario finally happened. Russia took Merv.
And the British reaction? A huge outcry in the press. The Mervousness peaked. But the government...
They did nothing.
They grumbled, they protested, but they accepted the fait accompli. The great game over Merv, this thing that had kept them up at night for decades, it ended with a whimper, not a bang.
So Russia now has the territory. They've conquered the Caucasus. They've conquered the desert. What happens next? What are the immediate consequences for the region?
The immediate consequence is colonization, pure and simple. Russian and Armenian immigrants flooded into the cities like Ashgabat. The whole region was transformed economically.
And this is where we see the term cotton bondage.
Yes. The Russian Empire needed cotton for its growing textile industries in Moscow and Ivanovo. Central Asia became a massive cotton colony. The Russians built huge irrigation works, diverting the Murka River to create new farmland.
But not for the Turkmens.
Of course not. They seized the best newly irrigated land for the Tsar's family and for Russian settlers, pushing the now pacified Turkmens further out into the marginal desert lands.
There is a really strange twist here, though. Despite the absolute horror of the massacre at Geokdepe, the Turkmens were integrated into the Russian military very, very quickly.
It's one of the great paradoxes of empire, isn't it? Within just a few years, the fierce Turkmen cavalry, the very same men Scobolev had fought, were wearing Russian uniforms. They became a prized unit in the Tsar's army, the Tekin Cavalry Regiment.
Why? Why would they do that?
Well, the Russians respected their martial ability once it was harnessed for the empire. And for the Turkmens, it was a way to maintain their warrior status and earn a living in a world where their old way of life was being destroyed.
I want to touch on how this history is remembered today, because the source material mentions a really significant shift in historiography after the fall of the Soviet Union.
It's a fascinating evolution. During the Soviet era, historians in Moscow tried to downplay the resistance. They framed it within a Marxist class struggle. It was the poor Turkmens against their own feudal lords, with the Russians as liberators, bringing civilization and progress. Shamil was a reactionary.
But that all changed after 1991.
Completely. In post-Soviet, independent Turkmenistan, the Battle of Geokdepe, or Gökdepe as it is known locally, has been totally reimagined. It's no longer viewed simply as a defeat. It's now seen as a moral victory, a foundation of their national identity.
And the sources mention the cult of personality of the Turkmen presidents using this memory.
Yes, very much so. The first and second presidents of independent Turkmenistan, Niyazov and Berdimuhamedov, used the memory of the battle to bolster their own authority. They cast themselves as the spiritual successors to their heroic defenders.
And there's a mosque there now.
There was a massive mosque with a stunning turquoise roof standing right at the site of the old fortress to commemorate the massacre. It's become a holy site of national resistance and memory.
It's amazing how the narrative can flip 180 degrees. The bandits of the Russian reports become the founding heroes of the new nation.
That's the power of history. It always depends on who is telling the story and why.
As we wrap up this deep dive, we have to look at the big picture. We started with the laboratory in the Caucasus, and we ended with the final frontier in the desert.
And it was a journey of adaptation for the Russian military. The machine learned from its failures against Shamil. It stopped trying to be a European army on parade and became a ruthless, engineering-focused colonial power. Scobolev was the ultimate product of that brutal learning curve.
And the great game, all that nervousness.
It was largely a game of shadows in the end. The British anxiety was real, but their actions were minimal. They were paralyzed by the fear that Russia would take the Turkmens and use them to invade India.
And here's the final provocative thought for our listeners. Just consider the irony here for a moment. The British were terrified that Russia would enlist the Turkmen cavalry and march on India.
And in the end, Russia did enlist the Turkmens. They did bring them into their army. They became an elite unit. But the invasion of India never came. The border settled. The game just ended.
The paranoia of these two empires shaped the map of the modern world. It left peoples like the Turkmens split between modern nations, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Iran, drawing lines in the sand that are still there today, causing problems today.
And it just raises that final question. In the game of empires, who actually defines victory in the long run? Is it the general who conquers the land, like Scobolev? Or is it the people who control the memory of the battle centuries later, like the modern Turkmens building mosques on the battlefield to honor their ancestors?
Something to mull over. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the forests of Dargo to the mud walls of Geokdepe. It's a brutal but fascinating slice of history that really explains so much about that region of the world today.
It certainly does. History is never really just about the past, is it? It's always about understanding the present.
Absolutely. That's all for this deep dive. Thanks for listening.
Goodbye.